You're holding a smartphone that can find a restaurant in seconds, translate a street sign, summon a car to your curb, and it already knows the word Chernobyl. Maps mark the exclusion zone as if it were just another park boundary, a gray ring on green. But that ring exists because, in one April night in 1986, a reactor's heart tore itself open and sent more radioactive material into the air than a wartime atomic bomb, and a living city of 50,000 went silent before noon. Sirens rose, then stopped. The Ferris wheel never turned again. Think about the light above your kitchen sink, the quiet hum behind your walls, the invisible current that makes your life feel simple. It's the same promise people believed in there. Power you don't have to think about. Warmth at the twist of a dial. An ordinary Friday evening with laundry tumbling and television chatter. A child asleep with a toy on the pillow. The line between safe and perilous is thinner than the wire that runs to your house. One decision, one sequence of routine steps, and the current can turn on its makers. Tonight, we won't just ask what exploded. We'll trace how a late-night test became a catastrophe, how orders, habits, and fear braided together, how firefighters climbed into a light they couldn't see, how the wind carried a secret across borders, and how the myth of an unbreakable system cracked. We'll step through apartments left as if time simply paused, cups on tables, calendars frozen in April, then follow the long echo. New rules, new skepticism, new questions about risk and responsibility that still shape the energy running into your home. So let's go back, not with sirens, but with quiet footsteps, into a spring night in the Soviet 1980s. The air is damp and smells faintly of river and budding trees. Street lights glow the color of old photographs. A midnight shift shuffles into a bright control room where clocks tick, pencils tap, and a test that shouldn't matter is about to begin. Begin here. A spring night that tastes faintly of river water and metal railings warmed by the day. The air over the town is soft, damp, touched by the scent of thawing soil and the last patches of snow darkening into earth. A warm breeze folds around the concrete blocks like a shawl, brushing laundry lines, stirring a lace curtain, carrying the whisper of budding poplars along the avenue. Someone on a balcony taps ash from a cigarette. It spirals down like a small comet and winks out on the pavement. Streetlights bloom in a color between honey and dust. Their halos pool on the paving tiles, and every few seconds a bicycle glides through, bell chiming once, polite, almost apologetic, as a couple strolls home. The bell's ring hangs in the air, then thins into the distant hum that sits beneath everything. Transformers, pumps, the persistent life of a power town. Underfoot, the square's tiles keep the day's warmth. The steps of late walkers make a steady, hollow music. An elevator door claps somewhere up the block. And for a moment, the whole stairwell smells of soap and wet wool before the breeze carries it away. In the apartments, small rituals unfold. A kettle ticks toward a boil on a gas ring. An enamel cup waits on a windowsill. Television chatter jumps between channels. A bit of song. A laughing studio audience. The low voice of a newsreader. In a child's room, blocks rest in a careful line under the bed. A sweater with patched elbows hangs on a chair. The boy who wears it has left a smudge of pencil on his hand from homework he didn't quite finish. In another kitchen, a woman smooths a paper label flat on a jar she intends to reuse. A man opens the refrigerator and stands there in the pale light, as if answers will arrive with the cold. He closes it, and the seal sighs, Shops along the main street face the night with their windows clean, but their shelves thinned by routine scarcity. A few glass jars of pickles, pyramids of matches, a scatter of biscuits behind a slightly fogged pane. The butcher has washed down his counter. The water on the tiles reflects the lamp like a shallow canal. A clerk locks the door by sliding a bar through the handles and gives the key an extra careful turn. She has done this each night for years, and her fingers move without thought. She walks away under the plane trees, counting her steps, listening to the soft patter of her heels. Above the roofs, the sky is a low velvet, not quite dark at the edges, brushed by the glow of the plant and the town's gentle spill of light. Far away, toward the river, the air vibrates with a bass note you feel more than hear. Turbines somewhere turning, water somewhere moving through pipes, the steady, arrogant calm of big machines doing what they were built to do. If you cup your hand around your ear and turn your head, there's a faint clatter of rail wagons from the freight yard, a coupler taking up slack, metal kissing metal. Its background, like breathing, like the slow ticking of the town's clocks. At the amusement park, still fenced, a shape like a skeleton crane stands, bright paint dulled by evening. It's not open yet. It will open for the May holidays, or so everyone has been told. The Ferris wheel is motionless, a circle drawn against the sky. Each car a seed waiting for sunlight. A few teenagers lean on the fence and trade jokes, their laughter soft and conspiratorial. They ride their bikes away 2 by 2, bells chiming again, their voices thinning into the night. In the schoolyard, chalk equations wait on a blackboard, a window left half open to the smell of chalk dust and varnished floors. A janitor pulls it shut with a careful hand and turns the key in the lock. On the river path, the scent of water is stronger. Reeds, wet wood, a trace of gasoline from a boat that coughed and stopped earlier in the evening. The path's gravel snaps under shoes. A fisherman checks his line and decides it's not a night for luck. He tucks the hook into the cork of his float and walks home, feeling the slight weight of the rod on his shoulder. A dog noses along the curb and returns to lie in a warm dent on a stoop, ears flicking at the smallest sound. A moth, drunk on lamplight, taps at a bulb and rests, trembling. The town's sounds arrange themselves into a kind of lull. The whisper of air through poplar leaves, the tick of radiators and pipes, a door latch finding its seat, a final burst of conversation on a balcony, a bus crossing the bridge with a low, patient groan. The concrete of the apartment stairwells keeps its cool. A hand sliding along the metal rail will come away with a trace of dust. Somewhere, a record player clicks as the arm lifts. Somewhere, a thin wall lets through a song at half volume, a melody bent by distance into something tender. The plant itself stands beyond the last blocks, like a promise shaped in rectangles and right angles. At this hour, it looks calm, almost handsome. Cranes stilled, ducts and stacks arranged in strict geometry, lights glowing at windows where the midnight shift has taken its places. The control room is bright as morning. Pencils tap on clipboards. A joke runs along the panel and leaves a line of smiles. In the turbine hall, the air smells of oil and warm metal. A draft carries that scent toward the river, and, on good nights, all the way to the edge of town. Someone stepping from a bus at the depot might pause and catch it, not with alarm, but with recognition. This is home. The scent of work, the scent of energy harnessed and sent outward, a low thunder made domestic. In living rooms, lamps are flicked off one by one. Curtains are drawn with a rasp, then fall still. The town settles into the sort of quiet that belongs to places sure of themselves. It is a quiet made of trust in routines, in schedules printed in black ink, in the feeling that tomorrow will match today closely enough to plan around. A watch is wound and set on a bedside table. A book closes on a finger, then opens again for one more page. On balconies, two cups grow cold while a conversation trails to a friendly end. Down the hallway, someone waters a ficus from a chipped pitcher and laughs at the way the leaves catch droplets of light. Stand, for a moment, at the corner where the avenue meets the square. The clock over the cultural center counts smoothly upward. The posters on the notice board curl slightly at their edges. The breeze moves along the long facade like a bow drawn over strings, drawing out a tone you can almost hear if you let your thoughts unhitch from the day. Everything is ordinary in a way that feels almost ceremonial. The town dressed in its evening clothes, the night fitted precisely over its shoulders. Across the bridge, the big machines continue their hymn, steady, comfortingly distant. Nothing in this scene points ahead. The streets carry only their own echoes. The light from the plant is the same light it has always been at this hour. A pale reflection on the river, a faint brightening on the underside of the clouds. The wind makes no comment, the bicycles no prophecy, the tiles no warning. Here, at the edge of April, the town hums with the life of small, decent things, held gently by the rhythm of a place built for power and comfort. And with that rhythm in your ear, the bell of a bike, the hush of a stairwell, the deep, far thrum, you are there, carried across years by the simple weight of sensation. The present loosens its grip. The spring night folds around you. The path toward the plant is straight and familiar, and somewhere ahead, a door opens onto a room of bright panels and ticking clocks. He was 27 and had learned to walk like a man who belonged among machines. Hands quiet, gaze steady, steps placed so nothing rattled. His name was Andrei, and the town had given him exactly what it promised. A bright apartment with hot water, a view of poplars and the river, a school close enough that one day his daughter would walk there with a satchel and a ribbon. A city of the future, people said, and he liked how that sounded when he said it too. On the night of April 25th, he slipped out of his building with his lunch in a tin and the faint smell of laundry powder still in the stairwell. The hallway light blinked once and steadied. He took it as a good sign, the small mechanical blessing of an ordinary night. Luda had left a note under the sugar bowl. Don't forget the bread. Kiss Katya before you go. He had, carefully, not to wake the child. In sleep, she breathed with a soft sigh on the exhale. A toy bear trapped under her arm, like a rescuer she refused to release. He stood for a moment looking at them. The child, the wife, the apartment, like a ship at harbor, and felt the rush of uncomplicated pride that still surprised him after a year in Pripyat. He was part of the reason the lights stayed on. He understood numbers and flows and the logic of heat turning water to steam, turning metal into motion. It felt clean, like solving an equation. It felt like adulthood ought to feel. The bus to the plant smelled of oil and damp coats. A few men dozed, chins tucked, hands in pockets. Two others talked softly about a football match that would be played in May. Out the window, the town moved past in familiar shapes. The cultural center with its posters for spring concerts, the empty amusement park, the great wheel frozen like a coin against the dark. Andrei thought, not for the first time, that he would take Katya there when it opened, that he would buy sweet bread and carry her if she got tired. The thought warmed him. He let it sit, intact. Inside the plant, the air changed, drier, edged with the smell of oil and warm insulation. He showed his pass, buttoned his jacket, and walked into the bright geometry of corridors where every line led somewhere practical. The control room of Unit 4 welcomed him with its own weather. White light, the faint hiss of ventilation, the patient ticking of relays, the green glow of indicators arranged in tidy constellations across the panels. Colleagues looked up and nodded. Sasha, older by a decade and inclined to paternal advice, said, "On time, as always." Victor, the shift chief, slid a clipboard toward him. The late-night test had been delayed. Day shift had handed them a knot to untie. He read the log, pencil poised. Another postponement. Another set of clearances to renew. Another dance with the schedule. He'd learned the choreography. Hold power. Wait for permission. Run the turbine rundown to see if the spinning giant could feed the emergency pumps for long enough in case of a blackout. He could recite the purpose in his sleep. He also knew that reactors liked habit. They did not like being kept low and waiting. He remembered a lecture once about xenon and how it crept into the core like mist and made the chain reaction sullen. He felt a small pebble of doubt in his shoe, as if the night had somehow stepped out of its proper groove. "Stop reading and start working," Sasha said lightly. But his eyes flicked to Andri's face, measuring. "We do what we do. We do it clean. We go home." "We go home," Andri echoed, and wrote down the numbers that meant the world was behaving itself. To be responsible is to have two minds at once. In one mind, he watched the control room perform its ordinary miracle. Heat captured, steam tamed, electricity marched in orderly ranks through wires. In the other, he thought of Liuda's hair across the pillow, of Katya's small heel pressed against the leg of the bed, of the quiet domestic universe his work defended. The tension between them never resolved. It vibrated like the hum beneath the floor. If he did his job well, it meant he could keep the job, keep the apartment, keep the life. If he spoke up at the wrong moment, if he sounded hesitant when confidence was required, things could go badly. In training, they had praised initiative, but rewarded obedience. He had learned how to read a room as well as he read dials. Permissions came, late. The test stayed on the calendar, but not at a time any of them would have chosen. They began the steps, methodical as prayer. Valves adjusted, pumps brought on and taken off. Commands given in voices pitched to carry but not alarm. The reactor's power dipped too far. "Bring it back," Victor said. They worked it back, slow, careful, coaxing it like a stubborn horse. When the needles were still sluggish, Sasha allowed a few measures he did not love. They all knew the rule book. They all knew where it bent under the thumb of reality. "Don't worry," Sasha murmured, as if Andri had spoken. "This is a test for the turbine, not the core. Keep your ledger. Keep the time." "I'm not worried," Andri said, and this was almost true. He felt what he sometimes felt, walking a narrow bridge, a sharpened awareness, everything inside him arranged to keep the balance. He copied down a value, checked it against another. He looked at the clock. He imagined, unwillingly, the silence of their apartment now, the city tucked into itself, the river moving past with its own implacable patience. He thought of his father, a province away, a man who had worked in a factory where no one expected glory, only a good pair of boots and a steady winter. "You did well," his father would say, without turning his head from the radio. Compliments were a kind of national thrift. He had not always believed in the system. He had believed in the math. But the math lived in the system like a bird in a cage, and he had learned to love the bars too. A new apartment, a new television, a clinic where a doctor would see your child. The plant gave him these things and asked only that he be part of its smooth function. Reactors did not explode. Teachers had said that with a confidence that felt like gravity. Reactors were big, deliberate machines, incapable of improvisation. People erred. The machine, in the end, returned them to the path. He let that belief hold some of his weight. The room's tempo altered by degrees. It wasn't panic, nothing as dramatic as that, but a tightening, a minor key that threaded through the familiar melody. The turbine rundown began, and with it, the stopwatch in his hand took on a small authority. He called the times, clear, crisp. The numbers fit their forms. He marked, he repeated, he was a metronome you could trust. The test was a narrow tunnel you walked through by counting your steps and not looking at the walls. A voice on the internal phone asked for confirmation of a step. Victor gave it. Another voice asked for a double check. They did it. Light from the panels lay across their faces in flat planes. Pencil shavings gathered in a constellation near Andri's pad. Somewhere, a relay clacked twice, a sound he had heard 1,000 times and could place in the room the way you place a friend's voice in a crowd. He glanced at Sasha, and Sasha gave him the smallest nod. Steady, keep going. The thought came again, call home, and he pushed it away. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like superstition. He would wake Liuda for a string of words that meant only, I am balancing on something and pretending it is the floor. He would not do that to her. He would not do that to himself. The most practical men he knew had a private ritual they never confessed. A coin in a pocket they touched before a shift. A sequence of steps never broken between locker and panel. His ritual was simple. He named things in his head. This is the panel. This is the clock. This is my pencil. This is my hand. This is the work. You could taste metal in the control room sometimes. Nothing sinister, just the faint tang of machines working. He tasted it now and decided it was a sign of his own nerves. He breathed through his nose. He let the numbers keep him. The second hand swept. His voice stayed level. When he looked up from the pad, he felt as if he had been underwater and had surfaced for a small breath of air. What he wanted most and what the room demanded were the same thing. Continuity, the illusion that every second grew naturally from the one before. What are you thinking? Sasha asked, not teasing this time. That the May Day parade will be hot this year, Andri said. Sasha caught the thread. Katya's age? 5 in June. She will not remember this test, Sasha said, meaning the work will pass, the world will continue to be itself. She will remember the wheel, he added, and both men smiled at the thought of the bright circle turning over the town. Victor's voice cut across the panel, calm but clipped. We proceed. Watch your ranges. Andri watched. The reactor responded, not exactly generously, but within the band you could call acceptable if you spoke without adjectives. He wrote that too, in the way he wrote everything. The way a faithful scribe records the day's weather, clouds, wind from the east, the feeling that rain might not come after all. He had known fear before, schoolyard, exam hall, army physical. But this wasn't fear. It was its cousin, the awareness of carrying something you could not drop, something that belonged to other people as much as to you. He thought of power the way a farmer might think of rain, not as a moral force, but as a fact you learned to live with. You measured. You did not beg. Still, somewhere in him, a smaller voice said, "Steady now." And he listened, the way you listen to a child in a room full of adults, half amused, half instructed. They crossed a threshold he would later remember with embarrassing clarity. A line of ink on a clipboard, a switch that made a sound no different from the sound it always made. The body marked it anyway. A film over the skin, a pressure in the ear. He glanced at the clock and found himself counting heartbeats between ticks. He steadied. He read numbers. He called time. The room brightened, or else his eyes did. He would not be able to say. He saw Victor's hand hover, decisive. He saw Sasha's jaw set, not with worry, but with that specific stubbornness men bring to a task they have decided will not defeat them. He felt the plant around them like a great animal, asleep under their hands, breathing, turning, massive, trusting them to keep it in its proper dream. Later, there would be words for what happened next, and arguments about which words were honest. In the moment, there was only sensation arranged into a shape too large for comprehension. A shudder moved through the floor, a deep thump like a fist struck into the building's sternum. A wind seemed to rise from inside the walls. Lights flickered as if the room had blinked. Somewhere, metal screamed. A tearing, a wrench. Andrew's hand moved without him, the way hands do when training is the only thing left. The button that meant stop, the voice that meant halt. A Z5. Scram. The sound that followed was not a sound he had a place for. It set the teeth on edge, then knocked the breath from the chest. Dust lifted, a gray breath of the building itself. Papers stepped off their tidy stacks and slid across the panel as if an invisible palm had pushed them. In the same instant, the room filled with declarations, lights that meant trouble, alarms that meant attention. But this was not the hurried but comprehensible music of a minor incident. It was a chord struck with both fists. Andrei tasted metal again, stronger. His first thought was not a thought. Lyuda. Katya. His second was a command. Stay. He stayed. He heard someone call. What was that? And someone else, flat as if reciting in a drill. Loss of. And the rest swallowed by another concussion. The air itself seemed to tilt. A panel glass cracked with the sound of ice in a glass. They were all on their feet without deciding to be. He did what he always did. He made a list. Not on paper. His hand was busy on the panel, but in his mind, check this. Say that. Find that value. Call this out. His voice found its pitch and joined the others. An instrument, not a solo. The room shook again, then settled into a vibrating unease, as if the building had become a tuning fork. Sasha's face had changed, not to fear exactly, but to a vast seriousness that made him look older. Stay at your post, he said, and Andrei understood he was speaking to all of them, but also to him. The order was both professional and personal, and Andrei absorbed it the way a bridge absorbs the weight of a truck, with a flex hidden inside its structure. He thought, wildly and for a fraction of a second, of ringing home. He saw the black telephone in their kitchen and Lyuda's hand lifting the receiver, hair mussed, voice husky with sleep. He pictured himself saying, "What?" There are nights when a man is court and witness both, and he gives his own testimony in silence. He let the image go. Instead, he reached for the words that kept men anchored. Power reading? He asked, and got back a number that did not make sense to him. Cooling flow? Another answer. Another piece that did not sit properly in the puzzle. The room filled with the friction of not knowing, and he felt the old faith rise. Machines do not improvise, people do. Yet here was a system improvising. Or else the instruments were singing in bad harmony, or else the event was outside all expectation, and the panel was a map of a country that had moved while they were not looking. The doors opened and closed on messengers and supervisors. Boots stamped, orders snapped, and were acknowledged. Andrei saw the narrow corridor beyond, full of dust and a light like dawn pressed flat. He understood that he was in the precise location where his life met its use. This is the work, he told himself, and the words were both insufficient and steadying. He kept to his panel. He kept to time. He felt the building around him, like a ship suddenly in a sea, not accounted for on any chart. The smell changed. Later, he would call it metallic. But in the moment, it was simply wrong, like milk turned in a warm room. The hair on his arms rose. He swallowed. He thought of a day with his father by the river, when lightning had gone silent across the sky in pale forks, and they had counted the seconds to the thunder. 1, 2, 3. The storm was near or far, depending on the math. Tonight, there was no counting. There is a species of courage that looks exactly like patience. It holds fast not because it cannot imagine running, but because it has decided running would rip the world. Andrei felt that courage put on his body like an extra garment. He took the next measurement. He said the next thing out loud. He watched Victor write with a pencil that shook only as much as the building did. A line from training surfaced. If you do not have the data you want, work with the data you have. He did. He understood that every number might be lying to him. Still, he built a provisional truth and lived inside it long enough to act. He knew that later, men in quiet rooms would compare notes and find better truths, will draw diagrams with neat arrows, will put cause and effect into a row. He knew only the present tense, the long elastic second that contained too much. Someone said, "It can't be," and bit the sentence in half, as if even the grammar of the thought was dangerous. Someone else said, "It is." Andrei did not look to see who had spoken. He watched the light that meant a pump had quit. He watched another that meant a door had opened somewhere it should not. He heard the edge creeping into voices and kept his own dull with purpose, the way you keep a knife dull around a child. In the thin space between steps, his mind slipped back to the apartment, not as a place to flee, but as a reason to stay. The life he loved did not need him as a husband at this second. It needed him as an engineer. That was the bargain he had made when he put his name on the line and took the keys to a flat with a view of the river. He could be the man whose hands joined the city to its power. He could be the man who did not run. He remembered the first time he had walked into this room. The boards had seemed like an altar. The needles had seemed like birds that could be startled. He had thought, if I learn their moods, they will trust me. It was a childish thought, and not entirely wrong. Tonight, the birds were panicked, and the altar had cracked, and yet he was here with his offering. Attention, steadiness, the willingness to do a small thing correctly inside a large wrong. A runner arrived with a face powdered in dust and a report in a voice hoarse as gravel. Andri heard only fragments, words you would not expect to hear in a place built to make the improbable routine. The room received the report and did not argue with it out loud. You could feel the argument in the silence, the part of every man that believed in the inviolate center, refusing to look at the idea that the center could be gone. He did not have to be told that people were already on staircases, already outside, already moving toward whatever needed hands and courage. He did not yet know that some of them had walked into a light without color. He knew only that the control room asked for his attention, and he gave it like a tithe, like a vow. Numbers, calls, acknowledgments, the simple grammar of work that keeps panic from making sentences. At some point, a minute, a century, the alarm steadied into a kind of background, the way grief does after it spends itself. The room became a place where decisions could be made, even bad ones, even partial ones. Andri felt a thin wire connect him to the town, an invisible line running under floors and streets to the bed where his daughter slept with the bear trapped under her arm. He did not imagine the worst. He did not allow himself the luxury of images. He kept to the small square of light in front of him. Later, much later, someone would ask him what he had felt, and he would say, with embarrassment, proud. Not of the event, not of the outcome, not of anything large. Proud of the small fidelity he had shown to his craft, to his colleagues, to a town that had made a place for his family and would need every scrap of competence the night could gather. The word would taste wrong in his mouth, and yet the truth of it would stand. For now, the truth was simpler. He had been a boy taught to believe that systems were steel and people were clay. The night taught him the opposite. He stood where he was placed and did what he could do. And in that limited circle of action, a complicated love revealed itself. Love for the measurable and the human, for the panel and the sleeping kitchen, for the authority that told him to hold and the instinct that asked him to question. He lived between them, like a bridge that does not choose the shores it binds. The room, the night, the city, all of it balanced on a thin edge. He breathed, and the dust in the air settled in a faint halo on the surface of the console, making it look for a second like an object in a museum. He brushed it away with the side of his hand, gentle, as if waking a child. He announced a time. He wrote a number. He listened for the sound that would mean the world returning to its track, and, not hearing it, kept working anyway. By day, the city spoke in slogans. By night, it hummed in good faith. On the walls of the cultural center, the words, "Peaceful Atom," arced in neat block letters. Over the entrance to the school, a banner promised knowledge, the path to the future. The phrases were ordinary, comforting, the way a familiar melody is comforting. People passed beneath them on their way to work, to the market, to the stadium, and they did not argue with the tune. In Pripyat, the future had a mailing address, an area code, a payroll office, a parade route. It had a Ferris wheel waiting for May Day, and a hotel named Policia that was never quite full, but always ready. It had a palace of culture called Energetic, as if a building could be a person, the energetic one, hosting dance lessons, chess clubs, lectures about the sun. The city was young in the way a photograph is young. The average age hardly crept past 30. Strollers lined the courtyards like parked boats. Children wore red pioneer scarves on holidays and practiced salutes with the solemnity of surgeons. Saturday, Subotniks cleaned flower beds with cheerful efficiency. Men in shirt sleeves, women in kerchiefs, teenagers comparing blisters. The stadium's cinder track recorded bare, uncomplicated hours. Laps, wind, the thump of shoes. The cinema Prometheus ran comedies and earnest dramas. People laughed, and the laughter had nothing to do with the plant except that it belonged to a town that could afford to laugh on a Friday night. Inside apartments, life rehearsed its comforts. Rugs on walls softened concrete. Crocheted doilies guarded armrests like small snowfields. A television with a wooden frame glowed square and authoritative in the corner. Mothers pinned laundry in tight soldierly rows over bathtubs. Fathers mended chairs with glue that smelled like almonds. Freezers hummed with a tinny confidence. In the evenings, a man might walk to the river with a stool and a line and trade jokes with a colleague about the factory weather. They joked about weather because weather was safe. The wind did not report to anyone. All of this, the ordinary wealth of small joys, rested on a hidden logic composed elsewhere. The country spoke with many voices, but orders sounded like one: clipped, patient, descending. Lists arrived from higher up and grew legs, and walked through the plant. Shift patterns, maintenance windows, experiments slotted between other necessities. When the grid dispatcher in Kiev called to say the city needed power in the dinner hours, the instruction was a fact as solid as a door. You adjusted. You did not ask the door to be a window. Paper was a landscape everyone knew how to cross. Forms had boxes. Boxes had meanings. Meanings had edges. You could learn the way rivers learned their banks. Slow, inevitable, resigned. A man might grumble about scarcity, about the sudden absence of sausage or batteries, but he did not grumble about the logic of plans. Plans had calendar pages with red days circled. Plans had a way of making themselves felt when you failed them. A note in a file, a stalled promotion, a conversation in an office where the blinds were always half closed. Andrew's path into this world felt not like surrender, but like arrival. He had studied the mathematics of heat and pressure and believed they were a kind of language that did not lie. He married that language to a workplace where language had rules about what could be said aloud. At meetings, third-person passive was a safety net. It was decided. It was determined. Agency dissolved in grammar, and nobody fell. When a test moved from day to night because someone somewhere picked up a phone, there were nods. Night shifts were what you had people for. The system always had people. Obedience did not feel like bowing. It felt like being part of a machine whose beauty lay in each part, doing only and exactly what it should. In training, instructors praised intuition and then demonstrated precisely where intuition must stop. There were instructions thick as wrist bones. There were bulletins and memoranda, amendments and clarifications. Men learned them the way firemen learned stairwells, backwards, in the dark, with hands out. Deviation was a dangerous word, red around the edges. Initiative was praised as long as it returned to the charted channel. To err by the book was to be covered by the book. To succeed by leaving the book was to stand naked if anything afterward went wrong. Fear, if it existed, did not show itself as trembling. It wore different clothes, the careful phrasing in a logbook, the ritual checking of one's badge at a checkpoint, the instinct to let a senior man speak first. The word blame did not appear in the air very often. Responsibility did. Responsibility knew its rank structure. It sat on shoulders according to epaulets, and its pressure curved a man the way the earth curves water. If something went wrong, the current of blame ran downhill with astonishing speed, but it never admitted to itself that it was moving. The joke was that the river flowed upward in triumph. and downward in accountability. And yet, the pride. To walk into a control room, to be trusted with panels and needles and the big, sleeping power of a reactor, was to stand at the center of a quiet empire. The walls displayed portraits of heroes in lab coats and uniforms, men whose names were carved into plaques the way the names of saints were carved into stone. Speeches at award ceremonies listed virtues like stations on a railway: vigilance, discipline, modesty, collective spirit. Andrew did not sneer at these words. They were sincere, and in his better hours, they described him. The city gave him proof that he belonged to a project larger than himself. The light in his daughter's room drew a straight line back to his shift, to his notes, to his hand steady on a switch. Is there a finer intoxication? Outside the plant, the social life of the town spun on a healthy axis of rehearsal and reward. Parades were practiced with the same seriousness a laboratory brought to experiments. Lines straight, flags crisp, brass polished. Couples took wedding photos on the steps of the cultural center. Boys practiced headers on the patch of grass that would be dust by August. A kiosk near the square sold ice cream in paper wrappers that stuck to your fingers. People licked their knuckles and smiled. At the school, children glued cut-out doves to blue paper and learned the names of rivers that ran through distant lands they might never see. They learned slogans with the same clarity they learned arithmetic, and both seemed equally non-negotiable. Scarcity had its own etiquette. A neighbor, seeing oranges in a bag, would look away with exaggerated politeness, then knock later to ask, on an entirely different pretext, whether the bag had been heavy. The market had eggs when it had eggs, and sausages when it had sausages. Women learned to read the barometer of supply in the tension of a queue. None of this felt like suffering. It felt like weather. You carried your own bag. You planned for pearled jars of summer preserved for winter. You laughed at the way the milk foamed. You found satisfaction in making do. Inside the plant, a parallel city lived. Security turnstiles that clicked like metronomes. Dosimeter cabinets where film badges waited like tiny calendars set to the body. Lockers with dented doors and talismans taped inside. Saints without names. Clover leaves pressed into plastic. The hierarchy was visible, a garment sewn of small privileges. A word from a chief, and a door opened. A raised eyebrow from a deputy, and a suggestion retreated into itself. A man learned to understand silence as an answer, the way sailors learned to read a sea that did not speak. Everyone knew, without being told, that questions hardened if held too long in the mouth. You could ask how, as long as why did not wake up inside it. If a procedure felt awkward, you could smooth your discomfort by describing it as temporary, transitional, an exception that proved a rule. Words did that, spared the feelings of the book while you bent it a little. The culture of instruction made a shelter in which you could stand out of the weather of your own doubt. It asked you to place your weight on its beams. In exchange, it took that weight and did not complain. Andrew moved within this weather like a practiced pedestrian under a shared umbrella. He studied his chiefs, not for gossip, but for grammar. How they expressed caution as confidence. How they delivered orders as if reading the minutes of a meeting already held and won. He admired that act, and sometimes he envied it. He was not a rebel by disposition. He believed in the way work stitched people together, how a well-run shift felt like a song sung in tune. He also understood that the same song could drown out a discordant note that, in a quieter room would have sounded like sense. In Pripyat's evenings, the contrast was almost theatrical. On one side of the river, the cool logic of the station, squared and measured. On the other, playgrounds, dogs plotting their routes, the sweet smoke of skewers on a makeshift grill in a courtyard where neighbors borrowed salt and told stories about the price of boots. The plant's discipline felt cold to outsiders because it wore white light. But to the men inside it, the light was simply the best tool for seeing. They joked. They celebrated name days with contraband chocolates. They slipped each other cigarettes and advice. Humanity leaked into the regimented space the way grass finds the cracks in a path. Fear of superiors was less a drama than a posture. The man who asked Andrei about a reading might phrase it as a kindness. How are your numbers? The kindness did not soften the fact that some answers were welcome and some were not. There were consequences for being the person who named the wrong problem, at the wrong time, in the wrong way. Everyone had a friend who had been transferred sideways for an excess of candor. Nobody called it punishment. Words did not do that kind of work. They built corridors of plausible deniability and invited you to walk down them politely. And so, a test, shifted, delayed, nipped by grid demands, could arrive in the arms of men accustomed to making accommodation the way bakers accommodate weather in their dough. They would keep to the forms as far as possible and step beyond them only with the reverence of priests handling sacred vessels. One more pump here, one fewer there, a permission assumed because it had been granted yesterday and the world had not ended. There was courage in this, courage of the practical sort, which keeps trains running in winter and bridges open in spring floods. There was also danger, the creeping confidence that a system that had not failed would not fail, that an instruction read often enough became a fact of nature. On Sundays, the brass band played in the park, and old men clapped off beat with contentment. On Mondays, Andrei returned to his panel and felt the band's echo as a kind of blessing. This is why we do it. This is who depends on the quiet we make. He accepted that he was both servant and beneficiary of something huge. He believed the system's promise because it had kept faith with him in the currency he recognized. Heat for baths, a roof that did not leak, a clinic where a pediatrician knew Katya's cough. If fear was present, it was as fine as dust, visible only when a beam of light cut the air just so. It sat in the knowledge that your life could be made complicated by a file someone else kept. It sat in the instinct to nod when a senior man used the word necessary. It sat in a child's question at the dinner table that you answered with a gentler version of the truth. Why does Papa work at night? Because the city needs light when we sleep. The answer was accurate and incomplete. He left it like that. Accuracy often traveled with incompletion. The plant's gates made the boundary physical, but the deeper boundary ran through language. In the apartment, you could call the Ferris wheel pretty or silly. In the control room, you called a parameter within range. In the apartment, you could say your boss was tough. In the control room, he was correct. The same man lived on both sides of the divide, and the trick was to keep his faces aligned, his vocabulary sliding without grind from one surface to the other. On the night that concerns us, all of these currents, pride, obedience, thrift with truth, the weight of permission, ran quietly beneath the visible surface. A delayed test crossed a page. A phone call aligned a row of decisions. A room full of competent men let the system's voice speak through them as it had always spoken. No one there thought of himself as a character in a parable. They were professionals in a place built to translate fuel into comfort, numbers into light. The city slept on the far bank like a child on a sofa at the end of a long party. The plant breathed its steady breath. And this is the contrast that holds the mind. Laughter in stairwells and a clipboard in a bright room. A girl's shoe left under a radiator and a line on a graph. A joke in a locker room and the phrase strictly according to instructions, pronounced as if it were a charm. In Pripyat, joy and discipline had made a pact. The pact was not sinister. It was domestic. It said, "You do your part. The rest will be taken care of." If the pact had a flaw, it was the belief, encouraged by posters and speeches and the long, reassuring monotony of successful days, that systems can be taught not only to resist error, but to exempt themselves from it. Andre, who loved the crisp fit of things going right, placed himself inside that pact without theatrics. He did not pray to it. He simply used it, the way a mason uses a plumb line. Even as his private doubts sometimes knocked softly at the door, he greeted them as you greet a guest you cannot seat at the table tonight, with courtesy and postponement. The test would be done. The city would wake. The wheel would turn in May. He would carry Katya on his shoulders so she could see the river from the highest car. In the end, what held him in place was not fear of a chief or worship of a rule book. It was loyalty, plain, workmanlike, undemonstrative. Loyalty to his crew, to their competence, to the way their hands moved without colliding. Loyalty to the town's morning routines, the kettle ticking, the bus doors sighing, a woman washing her stoop. His mind made a bridge over the river between the cold grammar of the plant and the warm chatter of the apartments, and he stood on that bridge, counting, calling times, doing what he had been told and what he had told himself was right. The city had asked him for steadiness. The system had trained him not to doubt aloud. Between them, a man did what a man does. He kept his place. He kept his voice level. He held to the instruction that had, until that very hour, protected everyone he loved. History's wide-angle lens favors causes and consequences. So let's widen the frame around that bright control room and let the technical, political, and human strands come into focus together. First, the machine itself. Unit 4 was an RBMK, a graphite-moderated, water-cooled reactor designed to be huge, efficient with low-enriched fuel, and tolerant of the uneven rhythms of a Soviet electrical grid. In plain language, graphite blocks slowed the neutrons to keep the chain reaction going. Water flowed through channels to carry heat away and make steam for the turbines. Most Western reactors sat inside thick concrete and steel containment vessels, meant to bottle up the worst if the worst arrived. The RBMK did not. It was a design that assumed discipline more than armor. Two deeply consequential quirks lived inside that architecture. The first was a positive void coefficient. When water in the core turned to steam, creating voids, the reaction could speed up rather than slow down. Under certain low-power, low-flow conditions, that meant the reactor could respond to a disturbance by surging instead of calming, an amplifier where you wanted a break. The second quirk hid in the control rods, the long, slender tools operators used to tame or boost the reaction. Their tips were made of graphite, followed by a gap, and then neutron-absorbing material. When the operators hit the emergency shutdown, the AZ-5 scram, Those graphite noses entered first, and for a heartbeat, could actually add reactivity at the very bottom of the core before the absorbing sections followed. It was a razor-thin, catastrophic window, the kind of design flaw no operator could fix in the moment, no matter how brave or skilled. Now the experiment. The plan was routine in theory. Run a test to see how long the spinning inertia of a coasting turbine could power emergency pumps if outside electricity failed. It was a housekeeping question. How well the plant could save itself in a blackout. The test had been done before. On April 25th, a phone call from the grid asked the plant to keep producing power longer than planned. Dinnertime lights across the region took precedence over a technical curiosity. The test slid deeper into the night. The reactor idled low for hours, and a chemical called xenon, a byproduct that soaks up neutrons, built up in the core like fog. When permission finally came, the night shift inherited a machine outside the tidy envelope where it behaves best. What followed was a tug of war with physics and procedure. To raise power back to the intended level, the crew withdrew too many control rods. Fewer than the minimum required were left inserted. Safety systems were throttled or bypassed because, in the narrow logic of the test, they interfered with the scenario being simulated. Water flow and steam conditions hovered in a zone that made the reactor both stubborn and skittish. It was not villainy. It was the practiced pragmatism of men trained to make plan under pressure, inside a culture that praised initiative only when it returned neatly to the book. The clock stepped toward 1:23 a.m. The test began. The turbines coasted down. Pump speeds fell. Water boiled harder in parts of the core, carving steam pockets where liquid had been. The positive void coefficient reached out its hidden hand. When the operators, sensing trouble, pressed AZ5, the red saving button designed to end all arguments, the graphite-tipped rods started down. For a sliver of time, they added the wrong kind of push in the most sensitive place. Power spiked, far beyond what instruments could honestly display. Fuel channels ruptured, water flashed to steam, and the reactor's massive internal cap leapt. A first explosion tore ducts and pipes. A second, fed by hydrogen and superheated materials, ripped the building open to the sky. Graphite burned like a slow, furious coal seam. A blue light, as eerie as a memory, shimmered above the wreck. Ionized air. Not a miracle. In the first minutes after the blasts, the control room was a blizzard of alarms, many of them lying now because their wires were severed from any reality to report. Outside, shards of fuel and graphite lay on roofs like black hail. Valves jammed, doors buckled, stairwells filled with dust that tasted of metal and something nameless. A phone rang and was somehow answered. Inside the city, windows quivered and then settled. In bedrooms, a few people sat up and then lay down again. A thump at a power station was a distant thing, like thunder you needn't dress for. And yet, while most of Pripyat slept, another set of professionals woke into the worst night of their lives. Fire engines from the plant brigade in the town clattered across the bridge, ladders strapped like lances, sirens more dutiful than loud. They came for a roof fire, which is to say, they came with the wrong story in their heads, because that was the only story they were given. Men named Telyatnikov and Pravik and Kibanok and Vasily Ignatenko pulled on gear and went up stairwells that had become chimneys, climbed onto roofs littered with hot fragments that glowed without color, and trained hoses into a darkness that bit at their faces and hands. Radiation is weightless, odorless, and merciless. Their courage was the old kind, Habit, loyalty, refusal to let a blaze leap to neighboring units. They kicked burning graphite like cinders. They worked until vomit rose, and their skin prickled, and their mouths filled with the taste of coins. Some did not come down of their own power. Others came down and, by dawn, were headed to a hospital that could not treat what had happened to their marrow. Inside the plant, decisions stacked like sandbags. Flood what could be flooded. Cut what could be cut. Send runners where lines were dead. Unit 3 shared walls and systems with Unit 4. Men there fought to save their side of the building from the inferno next door. Supervisors argued in the particular grammar of a command economy, flatly, with certainty too loud for the facts at hand. Nobody in the rooms with the worst choices could see the whole picture, and the parts they could see looked impossible. A reactor did not explode. Everyone had been taught that truth. The night wrote a correction. By mid-morning, on April 26th, the city stood on two legs, ignorance and routine. Children went to soccer fields. Fishermen stood by the river. A bride posed on the steps of the cultural center. A few parents noticed nausea and headaches. A few doctors noticed symptoms that looked like flu and didn't act like flu. Dosimeters that could measure high levels of radiation were scarce. The ones at hand maxed out early and then sat stupid, saying nothing honest. The wind pushed a transparent geography outward, north and west, toward Belarus and then Scandinavia, south and east as the currents shifted. It had no border guards to argue with. The world discovered the accident by accident. At the Forsmark Nuclear Plant in Sweden, 2 days later, workers walking in tripped radiation alarms. The contamination wasn't coming from inside their own reactors. It was on their shoes and clothing from outside air. The Swedes checked wind patterns, did their math, and traced the invisible plume back across the Baltic to a silence too loud to ignore. The Soviet press, chastened by the undeniable, acknowledged an accident. Detail arrived only by degrees, and too late for many who had been on the bridge, in the stairwells, on the roof. Pripyat emptied on April 27th in a parade of buses that would become a photograph the world recognized at a glance. Hundreds of coaches in neat lines, announcements instructing people to bring documents and essentials for a short evacuation. 3 days, the official said. Apartment doors were locked with the keys still warm in palms. Cats watched from windows. Tea cooled. The 3 days became forever. In the following weeks, more than 100,000 people were removed from the 30-kilometer exclusion zone. Villages were abandoned to grass and time. Helicopters dropped sand, boron, clay, and lead into the open wound of the reactor. Soldiers with shovels cleaned roofs in 60-second bursts because that was as much radiation as a human body could tolerate in one go. When machines failed in the field of invisible fire, biorobots, men, went instead. By the end of 1986, a steel and concrete sarcophagus encased the ruins, less a tomb than a bandage. If history is a ledger, the accident entered on both sides. On the debit side, deaths in the days and months that followed from acute radiation sickness among plant workers and firefighters. Elevated thyroid cancers in children exposed to iodine-131. A diaspora of grief as families were rerouted by decree. Vast territories mapped in grays and reds according to contamination. Livestock slaughtered. Forests renamed the Red Forest for the color pines turned after the plume passed. On the credit side, if credit is the right word, came reforms forced by shame and fear. the IAEA convened new rules for early notification and mutual assistance. A new seriousness about safety culture spread through an industry that had too often considered itself a priesthood immune to ordinary error. The World Association of Nuclear Operators formed so that plants would share mistakes as frankly as they shared triumphs. The RBMK fleet itself was modified, control rods redesigned without the traitorous graphite tips, more absorbers added to live inside the core, operating rules tightened so that the dance at low power could not recur. Politically, the blast punched a hole in the story the Soviet state told about its unerring competence. Glasnost, the policy of openness, wasn't born in the ruins, but the disaster made the old secrecy untenable and the new candor urgent. When, weeks later, the General Secretary finally addressed the public at length, the delay was part of the message. A government that did not trust its citizens with the truth learned that secrets are poor sandbags against reality's flood. The accident did not cause the end of an empire, but it accelerated corrosion of faith, of fear, of the glue that held the myth together. The world's attitude toward the atom tilted. In some countries, referenda and parliaments turned against nuclear expansion. In others, programs paused, then resumed with sterner engineering and more skeptical oversight. Engineers adopted the language of humility more readily. Regulators carved phrases like defense in depth and design basis accident into their rulebooks with thicker pens. Manuals thickened. Drills lengthened. The idea that a plant must be designed to fail safely, not simply to operate well, moved from preface to doctrine. And then time, implacable as a conveyor, carried the scene forward. Wildlife threaded through empty apartment blocks. Birch saplings shouldered up through asphalt. Wolves and boar learned to read a city's floor plan. The sarcophagus aged faster than its builders hoped. In the 21st century, the world slid a new arch, the new safe confinement, over the old shelter. An elegant half-moon of steel meant to last for generations. A museum-scale reminder that engineering can also be contrition. Inside, robots nibble at the wreck, piece by careful piece, because the future deserves fewer surprises from 1986. What does the night say now to us in houses lit by the same promise that lit Pripyat's windows? It says that risk is not the opposite of progress. It is its twin, and the work of adults is to keep the twins from resembling each other too closely. It says that systems inherit the character of their custodians. If we reward silence, we should expect it at the worst moment. If we practice candor, we may buy ourselves the extra seconds that separate incident from catastrophe. It says that design choices are moral choices. Physics does not forgive wishful thinking, and a flaw discovered only in crisis was a flaw present in calm. It also says that memory is a form of infrastructure. The story of Chernobyl sits under our modern debates about energy like bedrock. As nations argue about climate and fuel and the arithmetic of kilowatts, the word Chernobyl arrives in the room, a short, hard syllable standing for a long, complicated event. Some hear it and refuse the atom altogether. Others hear it and reply that fear alone is a poor engineer, that newer designs close the old loopholes, that humans must weigh hazards against harms already here. Between those positions runs a useful river of detail. What failed? Why? What was changed? What remains to do? Walk back for a moment into the control room with its bright panels. Imagine it emptied of the particular men we've come to know and refilled with us. Our hands would find the same switches. Our minds would be just as eager to believe the instruments when they tell us what we want to hear. We would be susceptible to the same pressures, to please a superior, to prove a plan workable, to keep a schedule that was printed in ink. This recognition is not an accusation. It is an invitation to tenderness toward the fallibility we share and to rigor in the systems we build around it. And beyond the engineering, there is the human geometry that disaster redraws, the arc from secrecy to admission, from denial to grief, to something like wisdom. A cloud no one could see mapped itself across Europe, and with it, a shared vocabulary. Becquerels and sieverts, evacuation zones and half-lives, cesium and mushrooms after rain. The language remains, not as a spell, but as a set of tools we can reach for when the next complicated risk asks to be managed rather than wished away. In Pripyat, the Ferris wheel never turned for the May holidays. Its stillness is now an emblem, a circle that frames a sky perpetually on the verge of evening. But the story is not only a still life of rust and silence. It is a ledger entry we keep revisiting as we decide, again and again, how to live with power we cannot smell or touch, power that makes our rooms bright and our arguments heated. The lesson is not that we must choose fear. It is that we must practice vigilant attention to design, to culture, to the tiny frictions that warn of bigger failures. The night of April 26, 1986, is over. Its consequences are not. In the quiet that follows sirens, in the long years after headlines, the work of memory continues. Calm, detailed, unsentimental. We step out of the control room and back onto the river path. The air is damp. The poplars whisper. Far away, turbines hum in other towns, in other nations. Their song can be a lullaby or a warning, depending on how we listen, and on whether we insist, with the persistence of those firefighters and operators, that our courage be matched by our honesty. I hit the red button, and the room became a weather I had never studied. A deep fist went into the building and pulled. Air that should have stayed obedient found a new, ugly direction. Lights blinked, as if the room had closed its eyes to gather itself. And then alarms arrived all at once, singing different songs in different keys. Dust rose like breath from the consoles. I tasted metal, thick and old, the way a coin tastes when you hold it too long between your teeth. A Z5, I said, because naming is a way to hold on to a reality as it slides. My hand was already there. The button had the same travel it always had, the same mechanical honesty. What came back through the floor did not belong to any training drill. A second blow, hollow and huge, and somewhere metal tore with the sound of a bridge cable going. Papers lifted, a pencil rolled, a panel glass cracked in a thin, disbelieving line. "Hold your posts," Victor said, and his voice had edges I'd never heard. We all obeyed, because obedience was the scaffolding that kept the room up, but my body had already learned something my mind refused to admit. The building had become a tuning fork, and the note was wrong. Values poured in from instruments that were no longer attached to the world. Numbers that should have been friendly lay to my face. I called times anyway. I wrote anyway. When the internal line rang, I picked it up with a hand that looked like mine and listened to a report that belonged to no possible universe. Roof gone, fire on the turbine hall, debris on the ground that was heavy and hot and not hot the way you expect. I swallowed the taste of iron. "Repeat," I said, because repetitions are how you make a story behave. The voice repeated, hoarse, and the story did not. We sent runners because wires had failed us. We tried to flood what could be flooded, isolate what could be isolated. Doors stuck, and then gave like teeth in a stubborn jaw. In the corridor, the light was a smeared dawn. Though the clock said it was still a little after 1, someone brushed past me carrying a coiled hose. Someone else pounded back with a face powdered gray and eyes bright like wet stones. Graphite, he coughed, almost amazed, as if naming a bird out of season. On the ground. Graphite is the calmest thing in the room. Black blocks stacked like promises. A moderator in both the technical and ordinary sense. It does not belong on a walkway. I stepped to the threshold, and the night struck my face like an oven door opening. The ceiling had torn. Stars were suddenly where the roof should be, their cold order obscene, like flowers at a crime. On the catwalk, black chunks lay like river rocks after a flood. A young man from the fire brigade, helmet askew, jaw set as if biting down, kicked one aside with the toe of his boot and cursed at it as if it were merely stubborn. I knew then, not with words that would satisfy anyone's report later, but with the part of the mind that keeps a tally you don't show to your superiors. This was not a pipe or a valve or a seal. The center had been opened. We were beyond argument. The belief drilled into us that a reactor cannot explode hung in the air like a sentence whose last word had been eaten by static. I felt my ribs tighten against a breath I didn't trust. Panic is loud. Inevitability is quiet. What washed through me was quiet. Back at the panel, the alarms had settled into a cruel music. We learned, quickly and unwillingly, which ones still spoke for real machines and which ones were ghosts repeating their last honest message. I tasted pennies again. A stinging crept across my tongue, and the back of my throat felt like I'd been breathing from a bag left in the sun. A man in a hard hat appeared, said something about water, about flow, about needing hands, and I went because moving was a way to keep the mind from circling the sentence I wouldn't finish. Stairwells were chimneys. Our boots scuffed ash into gray ghosts that tried to rise and fell back exhausted. The turbine hall breathed heat in slow, monstrous exhalations. Fire crews threaded hose through metal ribs and over puddles that reflected not flame. There was flame, yes, where oil ran or insulation caught, but a light with no color. I had no words for then. Later, I would hear the phrase, Cherenkov glow, and pretend the word had always lived in my mouth. That night, it was just a pale ghost above a wound. I remember a firefighter's hands more clearly than his face. He had big, useful knuckles, and the delicate habit of flicking ash off a cigarette with care when we'd met him in calmer hours. Now those hands grabbed things because there was nothing else to do. Lengths of hose, a tail of cable, a black chunk kicked aside because it lay where a man needed to put his foot. He swore at the debris, as if swearing could shame physics. His partner laughed, a breathless, automatic sound men make when the job is a little bigger than their pride. They climbed. They were good at climbing. We were all good at something that night, and none of it was enough. The building became a map of errands. I carried messages because telephones produced only silence and a ringing in the ear. I shut a valve because someone shouted numbers through a doorway and I was close enough to reach. I stood in a doorway and watched sparks fall like a brief snow. The taste of metal would not leave. It thickened until the air itself seemed made of it. I pressed my tongue to my teeth, the way a man presses his hand to his thigh to check if a wound is bleeding. My skin prickled where the sweat dried. There was a moment, two, maybe three, when the other reality tried to assert itself. I saw, through a long frame of window, the far bank of the river, as if nothing had changed. The thin line of poplars, the slow slide of water, a distant apartment block with one kitchen light still burning. The sight had the tenderness of insanity. I wanted to go home, and, at the same time, I wanted to sit in the control room until the room forgave us. I stood in the split until the next shout welded the halves back into one track. Men vomited and went back to work because there is a level of training beyond competence that is simply stubborn love. The love of your post, of the man next to you, of the idea that a building can be made to behave if you talk to it in the language it understands. Switches, valves, time. Some of us looked like ghosts early, others like men who had merely worked a long shift and would have stories later. Nobody had the right story. Dawn arrived thin and gray, with a chill that felt dishonest after the night's heat. The smoke moved in the new air like a thing learning to walk. Helicopters beat at the morning, and something fell from them. Sand, I learned later, and other powders meant to smother fury. On the bridge into town, engines idled in a patience that made me want to weep. Buses, ungainly and noble, lined like cattle. The loudspeakers in the city, so gentle on holiday mornings, found their official tone and explained, in the precise voice of a father who wants to be obeyed for everyone's good, that there would be a temporary evacuation. 2, 3 days. Take documents, money, a little food, close your windows, lock your apartments. You will be back soon. Permission is a strange grace. By midday, someone in our chain decided that those of us whose tasks had ended or moved elsewhere could check on our families quickly and return. I walked out of the plant with the careful gait of a man who has lived on a ship and is not sure the dock will be steady. The road felt soft underfoot. The river smelled of reeds and wet rope. At the first apartment block, a woman leaned out and called to someone, and we both froze at how ordinary that was. And then we both pretended it was ordinary. Liuta opened the door before I knocked. Her face held 3 expressions at once, and none of them knew what to do with the others. Katya stood behind her, hair flat on one side from sleep, the bear trapped under her arm, as if I had never left, and the night had only been a noise in a radio show. Documents, I said, and the word tasted like failure. I showed them how to fit papers into a canvas bag we used for bread, how to choose shoes for standing, not walking. I told lies I needed to believe. Back soon. A precaution. We'll meet at your mother's if it takes longer than they say. I touched the faucet, the table, the chair, as if baptizing the room so it would recognize us when we returned. From the balcony, the line of buses looked like punctuation at the end of a sentence no one wanted to read aloud. On the street, a teacher with a clipboard gave calm to those who had run out of their own. Cat carriers, bird cages, a string bag with apples, a boy in a pioneer scarf carrying a chess set, a grandmother in a coat too warm for the day because old people dress against memory, not weather. A neighbor asked me if she should turn her gas off. Yes, I said, and then added, as if I were answering a question that hadn't been asked, and water the plant. She laughed. We stood in that small absurdity and then moved on. At the bus door, I crouched to Katya's height and tried to invent a father's face that would be brave enough for her and honest enough for me. You're going on a trip, I said. Count the birch trees, I said. Tell your mother when you reach 10 and start again. She nodded solemnly and looked over my shoulder at the river, then put the bear into my hands and said, "He's coming back later." I wanted to say that everything was, that time itself was on a round-trip ticket, that no story can end without coming home to check the locks. I said, "He'll wait for you here." Liuda's fingers were cool. "Will you come?" she asked, using the smallest, plainest words the language has. "As soon as I can," I said, which was the only truth left. The driver checked his list and watched us with the patience of a man who has been told to be a wall between families and time. I stepped back. The door folded shut with a sigh like a book closing. A row of faces claimed windows. A pressed flower. A reflection. A smudge. The engine took a breath. The line moved. Buses do not know the weight of what they carry. They obey the geometry of the street, the math of torque and brake. They turned the corner like a parade that had forgotten its flags. People on balconies lifted hands and then lowered them, unsure if they were waving or counting. The loudspeakers repeated the script about 3 days, and I realized that the voice had become part of the city's weather. Something you noticed and then no longer noticed, like wind coming around a building. I stood with the bear in my hands and felt that quiet certainty again, a truth that refused punctuation. We would not come back to the place we knew. I walked the stairwell one last time because the body likes rituals even when the mind refuses them. The handrail left gray on my palm. The apartment smelled of our lives, soap, onions, the faint sweetness of a child's pillow. I did the small theater of checking the gas and the window latches as if the building were a pet I was leaving with a neighbor. On the table, Liuda's note still waited under the sugar bowl. Bread, kiss the child. I slid it into my pocket because you take what fits. Outside, the day had grown too bright. At the edge of the avenue, a girl chalked a hopscotch grid, and then, as if remembering the new rule, dropped the chalk into her pocket and went to find her mother. The plant, my plant, the city's plant, brooded at the horizon, hunched under its smoke. Helicopters crossed and crossed, stitching the sky with a thread that wouldn't hold. In the control room, men were still writing numbers, because writing is what you do when you cannot persuade reality to change course. You make a record. You make a prayer of notation. When I reached the gate again, a soldier in a mask I could not read checked my badge with hands that looked too young to carry that particular authority. He waved me through with the same absent grace bus drivers use when school children climb aboard. I put the bear in my locker because I could not carry it to the panel without breaking. Sasha looked at me and nodded once. Under the ash, his teeth were very white. "Family?" he asked. "On a bus," I said. "Good," he said, and we went back to the only work the room allowed. The afternoon unspooled into a long ledger of decisions you would never choose to own and could not hand away. Somewhere, west and north, monitors in other countries began to hum at the edge of their range, and men in white coats frowned at readings that belonged to nobody they knew. In Pripyat, dust settled on plates and would never be washed off. A cat blinked in a window and yawned and found a warm square of sun on the floor where a couch used to throw its shadow. Time rearranged the furniture. In the quiet between alarms, I allowed myself one future picture. Not the return, not the fixed window, not the parade that would never rehearse again. I imagined telling Katya, years later, about a spring night when the stars came in through the ceiling and the bravest men I ever knew climbed toward a light that did not warm. I imagined her asking if the city had forgiven us, and me saying that cities do not forgive or accuse. They remember. I could live inside that answer. I could put my hands back on the panel and make the next small, correct motion. The buses were gone. The square was empty. The wheel that had never turned stood like a clock that refused to tell time. I understood, finally, and without drama, that I would never see the city as it had been. Silly, bright, domestic, sure of itself. What remained was work, and the long, patient discipline of living after a certainty has broken. I took a breath that tasted of metal and stayed where I was put, counting seconds, speaking numbers, keeping faith with men whose names would fall out of official mouths like medals, and with those whose names would not be spoken at all. Outside, evening began its slow walk toward the river. Inside, the consoles glowed. Between the two, the thin line of a man's promise held. Begin softly, as if setting a glass on a table in a quiet room. Chernobyl is a mirror we did not ask for and cannot throw away. Tilt it one way, and it shows human ambition in its best suit. The wish to take the heat at the heart of matter and turn it into light for kitchens and clinics, into warmth for children's hands. Tilt it another, and it shows the seam where competence frays. The shortcuts that feel safe because they worked yesterday. The grammar of orders that rewards confidence over doubt. The belief that a line in a manual can keep chance in its chair. In that mirror, we notice something uncomfortable and true. Disaster is rarely a single decision. It is more often a braid, strands of intention and habit and hurry, tight enough to hold until the moment it pulls everything down. But the mirror does not exist to shame. It exists to teach a more difficult tenderness toward ourselves, toward the way we solve problems, toward the ordinary courage that keeps complex systems running, and the ordinary blindness that can gather at their edges. We are not separate from the operators, the firefighters, the dispatchers, the chiefs. We are their cousins. We inherit their strengths, competence under pressure, loyalty to the group, pride in a job done well. We inherit their hazards, deference, stubbornness, the sweet wish to believe the world will be as reasonable tomorrow as it was last week. Chernobyl does not ask us to love fear. It asks us to love vigilance. It invites a humility that is not self-punishment but craft. The humility that says design is moral, culture is an instrument, and truth told early is a safety system. And then, just beyond human intention, time keeps its patient work. Walk there now, in your mind, through Pripyat's empty streets. Birch trees have found the seams in the pavement and pried them wider with a patience human lifetimes can't match. Poplars pour their pale fuzz across stairwells like a slow snowfall. In a kindergarten, tiny beds stand in rows, and saplings have threaded upward between them toward a square of light where a window lost its glass. A fox pads cautiously across the stage of the Palace of Culture energetic, pauses as if to listen for applause that will never come, then vanishes behind a curtain that smells of dust and rain. Where chalk once squeaked equations on a blackboard, swallows stitch the air with their small needles. A boar's hoof prints mud on a school corridor. A deer looks at its reflection in a window and accepts the second deer without interest. Wolves patrol the long grass of the stadium. A stork claims the rim of a cooling tower as if it were a natural cliff. Mushrooms, patient archivists, sort the forest's debris with enzymes and time. Lichens write slow messages on concrete. The red forest, killed to a rust color in the first hard days after the explosion, sprouted again, not because it forgave, but because life is stubborn and opportunistic and does not need our permission. None of this is a fairy tale of nature's innocence. Radiation persists in soil and bone. Hot particles, invisible as ideas, lodge where we cannot sweep. But the zone has become an herbarium of paradox, a place where harm and abundance share a fence line. It teaches that absence is also an ecology. When people step back, even for tragic reasons, other species step through. Owls nest in broken rafters. Wild horses graze the verges where buses once queued. In spring, the ferrying of seeds resumes as if nothing had happened, because to a birch, what happened has a different grammar and a different clock. Step closer to the reactor site, and you find another image of the eternal, a half moon of steel. The great arch slid over the old, cracking sarcophagus, gleaming even on gray days. It is both apology and intention, a structure that admits we cannot undo, but we can contain, that says in quiet engineering language, we will mine this for you, future people. Inside, machines with patient arms nibble at the wreck, and the plan for decades is just that, cautious nibbling, cataloging, constraining. If catastrophe is a sudden verb, responsibility is a long noun. The river still moves. In evening, the sky takes the same colors it took before the accident, the bruised purple, the brief brass of low sun. Rain falls with complete impartiality on roof and thicket, on turbine hall and reed bed. Snow erases tracks and writes new ones. A herd chooses a path for reasons of its own, and the path becomes a trail, and the trail becomes a corridor any map would envy for its clarity. The Ferris wheel, that emblem of a holiday that never came, frames these changes as if it were a camera that forgot to blink. The cars hang in their circle, catching snow, catching leaves, catching dawns, and dusk after dusk. Stillness, it turns out, can be a kind of witness. What do we do with this witness? Far away, perhaps making tea in a kitchen lit by a grid that hums obediently. One answer is practical. We thread the lessons into the places they belong. We treat early warning systems as organs, not ornaments. We pay more attention to the culture inside control rooms than to glossy brochures outside them. We compose rules that assume human beings are not angels. And then we reward the unglamorous acts that keep those rules honest. The raised hand, the second check, the awkward message, the log entry that says no when yes would be more comfortable. None of this is dramatic. All of it is durable. Another answer reaches beyond policy into the weather of the heart. Chernobyl asks us to consider the scale of our reach and the scale of our repair. We make machines that touch geologies and half-lives. We should cultivate virtues with similar range. Patience measured in decades. Curiosity that outlives embarrassment. Candor that stands its ground when reputation trembles. The past is not only a museum of errors, it is a workshop where we learn the feel of better tools. The word safety is often spoken like a warding charm. Perhaps it should be spoken like a promise, slowly, with the understanding that keeping it will be tedious and collective, and on some days, heroic. And there is the most intimate answer: memory as daily practice. Memory as an appliance left on. Not humming loudly, not heating the room, but steady, always ready to make sense of a headline or a policy or a boast. To remember, Chernobyl is not to live frightened. It is to live attentive. It is to notice when a sentence leans too hard on certainty, when a plan depends on everyone behaving at their best on their worst day. When a design has a hidden bright edge waiting to cut, it is to praise the unremarkable man or woman who, like those firefighters on the roof, steps forward without any story in mind, except this is the job, and then to make sure the job we hand them is worthy of that step. In Pripyat, trees push through balconies where chairs still face the view. In an arcade, a pinball machine's glass lies spiderwebbed and full of leaves. A piano in a school assembly hall wears a green scarf of moss along the keys. If you walk there with respect, you hear a soft orchestra, the hiss of rain through poplar, the tick of settling plaster, the wing beat of a bird startled by your footfall. Far off, the helicopter's ghost in the mind, though the sky above you is empty. The place is not only haunted by the past, it is inhabited by the present, a present with antlers and feathers and chlorophyll. Human time is short. Civilizations rise and fall, and they leave different kinds of traces. Amphitheaters, aqueducts, code repositories, particle colliders, a steel arch over a wounded core. Nature's time is longer, and also without nostalgia. A willow does not mourn the concrete it breaks. A fox does not eulogize an assembly line. And yet, we can let our shorter time borrow some of that patience without giving up our conscience. We can accept that our projects, however noble, carry risk. We can decide to carry that risk openly, with generosity toward those who will inherit our machines. We can build sunsets into our designs, clear, funded plans for endings, not just for beginnings. At the end of a long day, your own house hums with captured forces, somewhere far away. Turbines turn. In a substation, breakers stand like quiet sentries. In a control room, someone watches a panel, pencil ready. Between that far machinery and the small comfort of your light is a human chain. Chernobyl asks that we keep that chain strong, not only with expertise, but with the virtues that expertise needs when it is tired. Honesty, patience, the willingness to be the first to say stop and the last to say good enough. And as the voice lowers and the pace eases, return once more to the river path beyond the plant. Evening pools in the hollows of the land. Mist lifts from the reeds in thin veils. A rowan leans over a cracked stair like a friend who never learned the word after. Across the water, the arch catches a final stripe of light. And for a breath, it is only a shape, not a symbol. Just engineering, just care, just our species trying to be equal to the consequences of its gifts. In that cooling light, the story of Chernobyl becomes less like a siren and more like a bell. Low, resonant, steady. It carries across years not to alarm, but to remind. It reminds us that power and prudence must share a table, that beauty can grow in injured places without excusing the injury, that courage is most itself when it is paired with truth, that the future is not a prize we win, but a responsibility we tend. Listen to that bell until its note becomes a part of the room you live in. Then listen past it. Hear leaves brushing bark. Hear a distant animal picking its careful way through grass. Hear your own breath, easy and regular, as the night spreads itself carefully over a town that learned, too late and forever, how thin the line is between the ordinary and the irrevocable. Night wind moves along the avenues as if it remembers the names on the doorbells. It slips through iron railings and across the square, touches the chalky steps of the cultural center, and keeps going, a careful hand smoothing the city's tired coat. Windows stare back with a clean, unblinking hush. The Ferris wheel holds its circle against the sky. Each car a small bowl for rain and leaves. Somewhere, a curtain lifts and settles with the smallest whisper, the kind a room makes when it has learned to keep its own counsel. Out by the river, reeds tremble and recover. The water has the old patience. It pretends not to notice cranes, arches, warning signs. Closer to the plant, the air is cooler, like a church before the first footstep. The horizon begins to change color in thin strokes, gray to pewter, pewter to the quietest gold. The first rays of morning find the concrete, then the steel. They do not argue with what they touch. They lay themselves down and make everything briefly gentler. The razor lines of ducts, the exhausted geometry, the wounded place that learned to wear a crown of scaffolding and care. For a minute, the whole scene looks less like a wound and more like a promise kept. We are watching. We will keep watching. Listen to that silence. It isn't empty. It holds the footsteps of people who worked, and the laughter of people who slept, and the quick breath of men who climbed with hoses and stubborn love. It holds a child's toy left on a pillow, and a note under a sugar bowl, and the tidy pride of a ledger written in a good hand. All of it has settled here, not as ghosts that demand, but as a memory that steadies. Cities are not only streets and windows, they are agreements. Chernobyl is an agreement rewritten. Between power and prudence, between ambition and the patience to question it, between what we can build and what we are willing to maintain for as long as it takes. So the last thought is simple and heavy at once. Chernobyl is not only a tragedy, though it is that. It is also a warning with a human face. It says that design is a moral act. It says that courage without honesty is only heat, and that honesty without courage is only a cool draft in an empty room. It says that the future does not arrive by itself. It is escorted carefully by our choices, our attention, our refusal to let convenience speak louder than truth. Morning lifts a little higher. The gold on the concrete softens to daylight. In the schoolyard grass, a fox prints a brief sentence and leaves it for the sun to read. Birch leaves chatter with the lightest applause. Vines lean into balconies where chairs still face the view. The wind that began this farewell finds the far edge of town and spends itself in trees that have outlived the maps. What remains behind is a stillness that does not erase, a stillness that remembers. Let it be enough to stand here for a quiet moment at the meeting of river and road and metal and time. Let it be enough to say that the story has done its work. If, tomorrow, somewhere far away, a hand pauses over a switch and asks one more question. If a plan is written with one more margin. If a meeting ends with the word safety, spoken as a promise, not a slogan. The city will keep its watch in its own way. The light will come and go. The bell we've been listening to will keep its low note in the walls. And now we step back, gently, from the threshold. Night wind, empty streets, first gold on the reactor. Hold those images the way you hold a photograph that has learned to be quiet. The era bows without applause, and we bow with it, grateful and sober, aware that the past is not a place to live, but a lamp to carry. History is silent, but memory speaks softly.